Welcome to this evening's program with Benoit Denizet-Louis. I said the last part in French too.
So you said it great. It was perfect.
Welcome to this evening's program with Benoit Denizet-Louis. I'm Shuka Kalantari, executive producer of the Science of Happiness podcast at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. Now let me share with you all a little bit about Benoit. Benoit Denizet-Louis is an associate professor at Emerson.
You can throw in the Lancelot if you want.
Oh, that's later.
Yeah, that's later. Okay.
Benoit Denizet-Louis is an associate professor at Emerson College and a longtime contributing editor, longtime contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. He has written 3 previous books, including America Anonymous and the New York Times bestseller, Travels with Casey. His latest is You've Changed, The Promise and Price of Self-Transformation. And that's what we're in conversation about today. So thanks for joining, everybody. And I want to start with the fact that, Benoit, you have this fascinating background in reporting on addiction, recovery, and compulsive behavior. But as you described in You've Changed, at some point you were driving through the Wyoming rangeland, and you realized your interests in change had expanded from something clinical into the terrain of selfhood and identity. And I'm curious, what shifted for you that made you want to explore transformation in this broader and deeply more personal way?
Yeah, Shuka, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. Thanks for everyone being here. So I guess I never intend to sort of write about myself, but then I do in these books. And so I wrote a book about addiction many years ago where I followed 8 different kinds of addicts, some in recovery, some not, over 3 years. And I didn't intend to write about myself in that one, but then I ended up writing a little bit about my own struggles with addiction. So my interest back then in change was very like, who gets better, who doesn't, what accounts for why some people, like why that happens, like what's the sort of formula or what's the part of someone's personality or what are the techniques that they use to get better. Then in 2007, Michael Glatz, who I had worked with years ago in San Francisco on Castro Street at this magazine called XY Magazine, which was a magazine that no longer exists, but it was a magazine for young gay and bisexual men. And I've never worked for a magazine that like meant more to its readers, because this was like 1999. And so the internet was just starting and you could really feel like you were the only gay kid around. So kids would go to Barnes & Noble, or teenagers would go to Barnes & Noble and like read the magazine inside other magazines. Michael Glatz worked with me at XY and was the most like seemingly very proud to be gay person that I had ever met. Very political, very sure of himself. And we butted heads because I was not sure. I was like, things are complicated, man. And he was like, no, they're not. They're really simple. And so we had very different takes on the world. But he was this really inspiring figure for a lot of young gay men and really helped the magazine. Fast forward to 2007, he comes out as ex-gay and very religious and very conservative. So he switched these 3 identities that he had. He went to the opposite ends of that. And I don't know if any of you have ever experienced someone shifting radically their identities in that way. Like the trifecta, there was everything about him seemingly shifted. And it was incredibly disorienting. And I was not sure what happened. At first I thought it was a joke. I thought he was like joking. And then I thought he was going undercover as an ex-gay. And then he wrote another piece saying terrible things about gay people. And then I was like, okay, I think he's serious. And then I just got really interested in both, I went out to visit him in his Bible school in Wyoming, and I was really interested in like, what is his experience of feeling like a new or different person? Like, what does that feel like? internally. Like, how much doubt did he have? Would he talk to me about his doubt? Did he have fear? Like, he had to start over completely. Like, all his friends, relationships, it's all done. He's starting over. So I was really interested in that experience from him, like what he could tell me about that. And then I was interested in how the rest of us judged his shift. And the religious right celebrated it, said, yes, he's finally come to his senses. Gay men tend to do two things. Well, this was back in the day. Tend to do two things. So one is get very angry, or one is sort of mock him. So both of those things were happening to Michael. And this experience of being interested in how the rest of us judge someone's change and supposed new identities has stuck with me. And really, we've lived through these last 10 years we've seen the most profound amount of identity shifting, whether it's gender or politics or faith, that we've seen since the 1970s, which was another era of social change and political disillusionment. And so not only have we seen all this identity shifting over the last 10 years, but we've also seen the rest of us, I like to call it the parole board of the internet, judging other people's changes and transformations. And that's essentially what the book is about. So Michael was kind of like an early test case in what would become this thing that we've been doing for the last 10 years, which is watching people change their identities, deciding which ones of those we believe. And the problem is when you change your identity, so many of these transformations are booby-trapped with culture war politics. So it is, not only do you have to go through the change yourself and try to figure out what's right, and there's a ton of doubt that people don't talk about, but you also have to get buy-in from other people. When we change, we have to get buy-in. Like, Shuka, if I change and you're meaningful to me, and I need you to see that my change is real, and I need you to say, yes, Benoit, this shift, this new identity that you're claiming, I agree, I see it. And if you don't...
I'm like, nope.
Yeah, and if you don't, that's a real problem for me, and that complicates it for me. So, and we've been doing a lot of that the last 10 years. So not only do people go through the experience internally, and then have to convince their families and their friends, and that's one thing, but they also then, with social media and the ways that we're performing our lives, sort of have to get buy-in from the culture at large. So that's what the book is really about, the internal experience and then the external, how we judge other people's transformations.
Well, I'll segue to that then, because you talk about, the parole system of the people around us, and there's a section in your book really focused on that distinction between change and others' perceptions of change, and how that tension, as you say, sits at the heart of redemption. But nowhere is that more prominent than, at least in this country, than in our U.S. parole system. We have a large prison industrial complex, and to get out, you have to convince a group of people you've changed.
Yep.
What did your research in the parole system reveal to you about how we judge whether someone can truly change, and what that looks like based on culture, based on so many factors?
Yeah, so that was, I did so much reporting on that chapter. So I was really interested, like I said, we all have to sort of get buy-in. But there is this experience for men. So I focused on California's parole system and what men who have life with the possibility of parole. There's also life without the possibility of parole, and their changes are really interesting because they're sort of changing without any sort of carrot at the end, right? They're changing for, one of the things that often happens with people who have the possibility for parole is the victim's representative or the legal counsel essentially says, well, they're only changing to get out of prison. So it's a sort of interesting thing where you have to prove essentially that you're not just changing to get out of prison. In any event, California's parole system requires And it's shifted a little bit in the last few years. So the reporting that I was doing was around folks who were getting out in 2019, 2020, and 21. It's this incredibly complicated narrative that you have to put forth. And the narrative has to do a number of things. So the first thing you have to be able to show is you have to show deep understanding of your trauma that caused you, that sort of led you on the wrong path, right? There's sort of this assumption, which is often true, that there's like deep trauma. You have to have a deep understanding of that trauma. At the same time, you cannot blame that trauma for what you did. So you have to have a deep understanding, but you can't blame it. You then have to really, so you have to talk, you have to really show that you understand the trauma and how it affected you. Then you have to talk about the actual crime, and you have to, and talk about the person that you were when this happened. And essentially you have to say, you have to throw yourself under the bus, and you have to say, yes, I had trauma, but I could have made other decisions, and I made the decision that I did, and I was a terrible person at that time. I was a different person. These are the triggers that these were my triggers. These were the things I didn't understand at the time. So you have to throw yourself under the bus. You cannot sort of blame society, blame anyone who is with you. You really have to take full responsibility for what happened. Then you also have to show a kind of insight and remorse. Interestingly, remorse, like we often assume that remorse is like a really good thing in someone, right? So Shuka, if you like hurt me, there might be a part of me that would be really satisfied at your remorse towards having hurt me. But too much remorse is actually a really, really bad thing. So too much shame is a really, really bad thing. So one of the things that the men work, and I was writing about men, work on in prison was shame reduction, right? So they want you to sort of throw yourself under the bus for who you were, but they do not want you to sort of exist with this deep shame and go back out into the world with this deep shame. So you have to show that you've worked through your shame, but you also have to show remorse. There's a fine line. And you have to essentially articulate an arc of transformation about who you've become. So part of that obviously is a performance, right? Like we judge people's transformations based on what they say, how they're sitting, whether they look like they have shame or guilt. So there's a real performative aspect to this. And so I followed two men very closely, and I read hundreds of parole transcripts, but I followed two men's experiences as they went through this system. And one clearly got it. Like there are some prisons in California where essentially you're working on yourself. You can work, if you want, you can work on yourself all day long. There's a guy who came out, was paroled, he wrote a memoir, and he said, if I could find people in the outside world who were as like introspective and connected to themselves as the guys that I was hanging out with in prison, I'd be very happy. So essentially, you can surround yourself, if you're in the right situation, with men who are doing that kind of work. And if you're in the right prison, you can really do a lot of these classes, a lot of therapy. So one guy was clearly pretty transformed. Another one, it was really fascinating, right? It was hard to tell, like depending on which side of him showed up. And he went through, I think, 18 or 19 parole hearings over the course of several decades. And so, what did I learn from that experience? I guess I learned that a real sort of transformation of people is possible. Like some of the folks that I talked to, when you heard about like who they were in their previous, when they committed the crime and who they are now, they are different people. It's the same kind of transformation for any of you that are in 12-step recovery that you sometimes see in 12-step recovery, where someone really just feels like a completely new person. So I learned that people can transform, clearly. And then I learned that this is there's a real performance aspect to this. And that's clear for all of us as we change and need to convince other people. But their performance is so important for these men whose literal freedom depends on it. And then there's these commissioners who are sitting there, who are human beings and who have their own biases, judging these transformations and not always getting it right. I mean, it's a very hard thing to judge. And one commissioner would say, we don't want to see you crying. And then another commissioner would say, we like to see that you're wearing your regret visibly. So these commissioners are different people, and some had reputations for being much tougher than others.
Thank you. Yeah. I found it particularly fascinating because while, the outcome is less intense, it's not about whether we're going to be paroled or not. Like, essentially, there's these social cues in various cultures of how you are supposed to show your change. And
right.
if you veer from that, and again, you mentioned there were some immigrant cultures where they didn't get the memo that you had to do it this way externally,
right.
that you just missed the boat on that. And I feel like, again, in a less grave way, it was very emblematic of how we interact in our shifts now.
Yeah.
I want to switch to something a little less grave. And as someone who was born Sharir Kalantari, and then for reasons that half of you or all can't say Sharir, they had to switch it to Shuka when we moved to the US, and so I was always interested in names. And you have chapters on a lot of things. There's Zoom therapy, the cognitive therapy, psychedelics, trip to Esalen, and all super fascinating. But you have a whole chapter about changing your name and how changing your name could help you transform. And so I'm curious, Benoit Lancelot, Denise Lewis,
yeah.
What's the fascination with name change, and what did you learn on your journey of exploring names and how they affect our sense of identity?
Yeah. It was really interesting because I had never given name change much thought. I write in the chapter that, my name is one thing about myself that I've never wanted to change. And so as a person who had never really thought about changing my name, this was sort of all new territory to me. At the same time, my name is incredibly strange and sort of pretentious sounding, I think. Benoit Lancelot Denise Lewis. I mean, I really do. I think it's incredibly pretentious sounding. And so I actually, I say this could be a blind spot. I say this in the book, so you can all be like, yes, you're clearly pretentious, but I don't think I'm that pretentious. And, but I don't think my name fits me in that way. I'm not who I would picture as Benoit Lancelot Denise Lewis, but at the same time, it's fine. I like the name. It's a unique name. The Lancelot's rarely spoken. It's like a joke. I'm like, my middle name's Lancelot. So but the Benoit Denise Lewis, it's really unique. Denise is my mom's last name. Lewis is my dad's. It was fascinating. And my mom might be watching, but it's fascinating the trying to talk to them about how they had come up with that name, and they had two totally different memories. And I can't tell the story, actually, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I teased that, but to respect their privacy. But they just, my dad essentially was like, yeah, your mom forced me to do that. And then my mom was like, I didn't force him at all. There was this whole thing. And they each are convinced that they're correct. And this is such a fascinating thing about how memory works, right? I trust both of them that they believe that their version is the right one.
But then you went and looked at what would it be like to change your name?
Yes. And so I went and so there's this group called the Caballerians, the Caballerian philosophy. And two people, a friend of my dad's who had changed her name with the help of the Caballerian philosophy, she had recommended that I reach out to the Caballerians. The Caballerians are this very quirky, religious group, and in Canada. They're based in Canada. And they have this fascinating history because, I mean, it's a tumultuous history, but essentially they are probably the world's experts on name change. Since the 1930s or 40s, they have been helping people, not only in their group, because their group's really small, but helping people from around the world change their names or figure out what the right name is based on some numerology that I don't really understand. I tried to understand it, but I didn't. I'm really bad at math. So, but essentially, there's numerology involved. There's and they have been helping people for decades. And so one of the women who is part of this group has probably renamed more people than anyone else alive. I mean, I sort of researched that for a week, and I was like, is this true? And I actually think it's true, that she's helped rename more people. So even though they're this very strange group, I went up and interviewed them because I was like, you know, they probably know more than anyone else about how we change our name. And you may, if any of you are on TikTok or social media, there is this over the last 10 years, there's been this industry that has grown up. There's like these naming experts that you can pay money to, similar vein, who will help you pick a name for your child or change your name. So, I'm sorry, I have a little cold. So I go to Canada and I play along. I say, I don't really want to change my name, but if I did, what would be the names that you would give me? And they gave me a long list of ridiculous names, and so I did the whole like they essentially talk about having a divine mathematical formula to your name. They gave me a lot of possibilities for that, and interestingly, one of the women who had left the group said. She had left the group because she's like, they're a cult and I'm not going to be a part of it. But she said, you know, they're wrong about a lot, but she still thinks that they're right about the power of what we call ourselves and what we call our name. And she said, Benoit, I think your first name should be Bernard. and she had her reasons for that. And so for a day, I asked my husband, I was like, can you call me Bernard? And I write about this in the book. Like, he actually calls me from the kitchen. He goes, Bernard. And I like, and so sorry, I missed part of the story. The woman is like, you know, if you have this name, you're going to be able to stand up for yourself better. She's like, you let people walk all over you. And I'm like, maybe that's partially true. And so my husband goes, Bernard. And I really like, my physical posture shifted. And I wasn't going to change my name, but it was interesting, the sound and what it sort of did to me in that moment. I was like, oh, wow. I stood up straighter. So I spent time with them, and I spent time with Werner Erhard. Some of you may know, was the Est founder who famously changed his name when he was deserting his family. I spent time with folks who were trying to restart their lives and for whom a name change was sometimes both a way to sort of like make themselves unfindable to an abusive family member or parent, but typically more an attempt to kind of separate the past from who they wanted to be. And then I spent a lot of time talking to trans folks about their names, and I'm really interested in, I spent time with one young woman, Vivian, who her name change and gender transition was part of this larger attempt to shift her life and to be, as she said, like a better person. And there were also psychedelic experiences during this time, so it's hard to sort of figure out what was the exact like formula, the transition, the name change, psychedelics, therapy, sort of what worked, but it all essentially worked for her. And I was really interested in this idea. So trans folks, many call their given name a dead name, and that's a very powerful word. It's essentially suggesting both the seriousness of misgendering them, but it also suggests that their previous self is kind of dead. And I was really interested in talking to all kinds of trans folks about how true that felt for them. And there's this theme that sort of runs throughout the book, and I think we may talk about it, but when we do these big changes that feel really momentous to us, this theme that kept coming up, whether it was faith or gender or politics or names or whatever it was about this question of like what stays the same through the process. So what changes and what stays the same when we do these, have these transformative experiences. And so that came up whether people were on psychedelics and had these really transformative moments. You know, what stays the same? Is it personality that stays the same? I have a chapter about folks trying to change their personalities, and we can talk about how possible that is. But this question of helping people try to figure out like, and I really had to dig deep. I was like, well, okay, what has changed and what do you think has stayed the same? And they're like, oh yeah, stuff has changed the same. Like I still have the same sense of humor, or I'm still irritated by the same things, or this part of my personality hasn't shifted. So that became this theme, whether it was name change or these other things, that was really interesting to me. Because we often say, like Michael Glatz, prime example, like progressive, anti-religion, gay, far right, Christian fundamentalist, supposedly not gay, and he, you know, what's the similarity is that he's a black and white thinker who has never been able to like hold two things as being true. So the core personality, or the thing that I saw as his core personality, didn't shift at all. So that becomes really interesting in these sort of big shifts that people go through.
I'd love for you to expand on that. It was one of my questions. And we, you know, before today, we briefly discussed how one of your takeaways was that even with the largest transformations, your research, your study for this book suggests that the core personality may not fundamentally change.
Yeah.
And you talked about it a little, but how can you like kind of unpack that, break that down? Because we're talking about transformation. We're talking about these epiphanies, these aha moments.
Yeah.
And yet your theme throughout is that at the core, we're the same. So how do you reconcile those, or are they not things that need to be reconciled?
Yeah, I don't know if they need to be reconciled. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that, so someone, and I have a whole chapter on like these transformations that feel fast, instantaneous. So like people have these on psychedelics, or you're walking through the forest and you have an aha moment, or you have an epiphany. I think many people, if you think about, you might have had aha moments or epiphanies in your life, moments that felt transformative. I certainly did around realizing I was gay. Like that happened like that. And it was like one moment I wasn't gay, and the next moment I was gay, and I fully accepted that in an instant. So, you know, so what's interesting about people who have these mystical or profoundly these powerful experiences, which can often be really scary and can lead to what's called spiritual emergencies. And I went down to a conference that was really focused on these, like spiritually transformative experiences can be really destabilizing. So they're not always these great, powerful experiences. I read about a young man who his life really transformed in a seemingly negative way, although he then reinterpreted it after a 10-minute psychedelic experience. So, okay, so what shifts? Oftentimes what shifts is what we're gonna devote our lives to. So we come out of that experience and we're like, wow, I've been devoting my life to the wrong thing. I've been worrying about the wrong things. I'm gonna now think, I'm gonna like focus my life in this new direction. So I don't, you know, it all depends how we define personality, but that is a new way of thinking about the world. There's an expansive element. Oftentimes people feel much more connected to each other, much more connected to the world, much more connected to nature. So we can have these experiences that shift our goals, that shift our priorities at the same time. And those are like, those can completely shift like how we spend our time. That's a powerful change and experience. At the same time, the core personality of that person tends not to shift all that much. I wrote about people who were really trying to change their personality. I wrote about a woman who lives on Cape Cod in Massachusetts who's in her 80s and was really difficult. She had a really difficult personality, but she was attached to it. We get attached to her, like she was the life of every party, but like her friends and her kids could not stand to be in the same room with her for more than 20 minutes. She was fun, but she would also just insult you and say the worst things. So she's like, I'm in my 80s and I want to repair these relationships with the people who matter to me. I have to shift this about my personality. Like I need to change this. And she was really inspiring. I followed her for 3 years. She shifted in some pretty significant ways and was able to repair those personalities. At the same time, she's still like, she shifted. She's not like an angel now, but like, she really was able to shift, but through a lot of work. I mean, like therapy, hypnotherapy, psychiatrist, like the whole thing, right? Like she really devoted herself to this. I spent time with a bully, terrible, terrible bully who became a Buddhist and leads a Buddhist retreat center out in San Diego, where I'm actually going this weekend. He's fascinating. I'm like, well, what changed? And he goes, Benoit, I don't know if I've changed that much. I don't know if I've changed my thoughts that much. He's like, I've changed my actions. And that's a big change, right? I've changed my actions. But I still have thoughts that I don't love. I still have thoughts where I'm like about like I need to be the best, or like these things that like come up for him. So yeah, he changed and he stayed the same. And that's just a real good lesson, I think, in doing this, is like we have abilities to shift things. Like I wanted to be a better friend to my close friends, and I wanted to be a better son and a better husband. And I wanted to really, I prioritized shifting how I engaged with people in relationships that mattered to me. I set that as a goal. And I think I've, in many ways, and I had this awkward moment, and I write about it in the book, where I like go to my friends and I'm like, am I nicer? Am I, do you like me more? And, and I was like, please tell me the truth, and they were like, yes, you have shifted the way that you're in a relationship. You're less selfish, you're more vulnerable. And so I think I have shifted in my close relationships, and my relationship with my parents has completely shifted. And so that has changed. At the same time, like there's a mystery to change. Like we're not driving the bus completely. Like I've turned into my father. There's nothing I can do about that. I love my dad. For a long time, I was really scared. I'm like, I'm turning into my father. This sucks. Because we want to have a sense that we're like, that we're not just like, it's not just preordained the way we're going to act, but my dad's a writer. My dad wrote books about change, different kinds, but like essentially that. My dad married a woman from the Czech Republic. I married a man from the Czech Republic. I didn't intend to. It was no plan to do that. Like there are these things, and it's actually like, like a year ago, I would not have been able to say that on stage because I'd be like, it's so humiliating. Like, I mean, am I doing anything of my own volition here? And now I'm just like, okay, it's funny, it happened. And my dad reminds me that there are ways that we're very different, which is true. But all of this is to say is I think we can change things, and then I think we have to have
there's this obsession now with like metrics, and we put all these things on our arms that tell us how we're doing. And I think we're going to be even more focused on metrics as we go forward with technology that's going to sort of tell us how to change. And we have these change gurus and charlatans that are like telling us what to do. And I mean, you know, there's just a mystery to it. and I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a mystery to change. And also, you know, in my years of, and I'm sure all of us, like trying to be better and do the thing, and you're working hard. And I work on a podcast called The Science of Happiness. I'm like, can I just do osmosis and be better? But one thing that is reoccurring in my many years on the podcast, and it's because there is so much research on this, is the concept of kindness to self. And you quote Carl Rogers, and I hadn't heard this before, I love it. It says, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I can change." And you share your own various journeys of therapy and how you finally found a therapist that was like, it's okay, you have this addiction, just work from there.
Yeah.
And it gave you this understanding that if you're going to do any substantial change in your life, that it needs to start with a foundation of self-kindness.
Yep.
And you wrote, not being gentle to ourselves is, quote, like booing a sunrise. And the science really backs this up. Like self-compassion is linked to less anxiety and depression, more resilience, and maybe most importantly, more pro-social behavior. When we're kind to ourselves, we want to be kind to others. And so
Yeah.
I want you to reflect on, you know, why do you think, beyond the science, within your own experience, within your own research, why is self-kindness so foundational for transformation?
Yeah. I mean, when I was recently saw my therapist, and I said to her, you know, we were talking about she's watched me write this book for 6 years and struggle with it and all of that. And I've been doing my own work but she says, you know, it's so interesting, Benoit. I just thought of this the other day, that you've written this book about change and change in therapy, but she's like, I haven't thought of what we're doing as changing. She's like, I've thought of what we're doing as like acceptance and shame reduction. She's like, I'm not trying to change people. And that's an interesting idea that comes up a lot, right? Are we trying to change, or is change like changing, or is it finding ourselves and like getting rid of the things that are like false about how we're like portraying ourselves to the world, or our own sort of delusions about ourselves? So I had this, I didn't realize it, but the first 2 years of therapy with this amazing therapist was like all about shame reduction. I didn't realize how much shame I was still carrying. I had really no idea. And a big part for me, as you said, and I'm glad you like saw that in the book, which is like a kind of figuring out how to accept all parts of myself, the good, the bad. And it's not like we're letting the bad, I mean, quotation marks, like run the show, but it's like we're not, and there's another way, like I'm like my dad. My dad we talk about this, he sort of did the same thing. He's like, I had to like take in these parts of myself that I was trying to sort of deny or push away, and I had to treat them with gentleness. And Ram Dass has this quote where he said, you know, he's like, all right, so Ram Dass is like, I'm a jealous person like everyone. But he said, I've changed my relationship to jealousy. So now when I feel jealous, I'm like, oh, jealousy, you little shmoo, come here, right? Like this like softening of this experience that we're having. And like, oh yeah, of course you feel jealous. That's fine. Like, that's okay. So for me, and this was like very clearly like cemented as an idea during a psychedelic experience that I write about in the book, which was about, oh my God, like not being gentle with myself, which I had never been really. I'd always not been gentle, but like not being gentle with myself. To me, it struck me as complete insanity. And that that experience, that psychedelic experience, combined with like therapy, and then a lot of talking to folks for this book, has like made that really clear, which is a kind of like acceptance of oneself as critical to change. And I think one of the things that we do often, I went to this change workshop at Esalen, this institute in California, and on the board, we were in a yurt, and she wrote down like all the ways that we try to change other people: badger, shame, passive aggressive, all the things, yell at them, whatever, all the things that we change other people. And then she had a dramatic pause, and then she said, these are actually also the ways that we try to change ourselves. And she's like, that doesn't work. And so her whole thing was like creating conditions, stop beating ourselves up, and let's create conditions and stop focusing so much on like, oh, I have to change, I have to change, I have to change, I have to change, and creating conditions where the right people, the right environment, where change is more likely to sort of organically happen. And I've come to, at least in my own experience, really believe in that. Because for years I was like, I have to change, I have to change, I have to change. And I really struggled with that. And I think a lot of, I don't know if any of y'all relate, but it's a tough, especially when we're beating ourselves up. But that's the way that we've learned to do it. Like I'm gonna do this myself. I'm gonna change. Reality is, like, we need to create conditions, and we need to have other people in our lives. We often say like, oh, you need to change for yourself or it's not real. And I think that's a point I try to make in the book, which is like, we change in community with other people. Like, it's not, our isolated shifts are not, they feel really personal, but they're like, we're in community. And so having other people believe in us or say that we can change, and this was particularly true for the incarcerated men who said, before I was ready to change, I had a family member who said, you can change and we believe in you. And that was a profound moment.
So self-compassion is a foundation of being the change, which is the name of the final chapter in your book. And there's a famous phrase that I'm sure many of you have heard: be the change that you want to see happen. And incidentally, that is not by Gandhi, but by a lady in Scottsdale, Arizona, who Benoit visited.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear about that, the breakdown of that. And also, you teach at Emerson,
yeah.
And you also pose this question to your students there. So if you can unpack, clarify for all of us that, Gandhi, as great as he is, did not say, be the change that you want to see happen.
Yeah.
What did you unpack about that phrase?
Yeah, so he said very similar things. And so, most famous, 60, 70% of famous quotations are actually not said by the person that we all think they're said by. I don't know if any of you have done research on this, but if you start Googling for 5 minutes, you'll figure it out. So historians who've looked at this have decided that it's this woman named Arlene Lawrence, who I believe is 87 now. And she's lived a life of relative anonymity. And she essentially had this sort of mystical experience, which we won't totally get into, but it was on Big Sur. She felt one with the flower. Her life transformed in that moment. She soon divorced her husband, went back to the school in New York where she was teaching, has this mystical experience where she claims that love principles sort of came into her. One of them was, be the change you want to see happen, without trying to change anyone else. She says it's the comma and after the comma that we have a big issue with. And I think that's probably true, right? Like, we're always trying to change other people. And so that's a hard one to live with without trying to change anyone else. Obviously, this phrase is an iconic one. We've been saying it since the mid-1970s. And I think it's really interesting because it can mean so many different things, right? It can mean like go out in the streets and protest and dismantle institutions. and it can mean go to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, meditate for 2 years, come back a transformed person, and your energy will transform other people who will then be similarly transformed, and the world will be a wonderful place. So, and there's other interpretations. Conservatives have their own interpretation. Like there was a senator who used the phrase for Trump's sequel and said, this is what he got elected to do, to be the change. Trump has never said the phrase, interestingly. But so it can mean many different things. And Arlene, who lives in this retirement community in Arizona, is this very interesting woman, but she's lived a life of relative anonymity, right? Like she'll stop someone on the street if they have a Be the Change t-shirt and be like, I wrote that, and they'll be like, and she'll go up to people at the supermarket and ask like, what's the most meaningful thing in your life? And she has this way about her that like people don't banish her from the produce aisle. They sort of answer the question. So she's an interesting woman. I became interested, like, what does it mean in these times that we live in, which are profoundly scary, messed up, confusing. We have more depression, more anxiety, more loneliness, more of all the bad stuff over the last 5 or 10 years. And so what might that mean to be the change today? That's what the last chapter is sort of asking, like, where do we go from here? You brought up my students. When I brought this up to my students last year in class, there was kind of a mini revolt. It was a class about change and transformation, and they said, essentially, and they were great. There was a great class, and we had like earned a lot of trust. So like they were angry with me, but it was like fine because we had a great semester. They're like, Benoit, what do you mean? We have no, like, essentially I was like, how are you all going to be the change? And they didn't say, okay, boomer, but they were like, what are you talking about? Like, we can't be the change at all, right? Like, we don't even know where to start. And so I do think that is a kind of difference from the 70s where like many political activists who became disillusioned turned to meditation, turned to guru worship, sort of turned interior. And I don't know where like my students and young people are going to sort of turn and what's going to be the way that they might feel. So some of them are like, you have to be local. And by local, they meant just like in their friend group, they were going to try to be the change. Others talked about technology. I think there's a moment that's really actually happened in the last 6 months or year where a lot of young people are like, I'm going to try to be the change by not participating in the crack cocaine of my phone. And I'm going to figure out how to either get rid of my phone or have a different kind of relationship to it. But there was also a lot of people who were like, I think we're just going to retreat further and further into our devices and our phones. And there was a kind of pessimism around the idea of being the change that was like really pretty sad. And again, there were some students who had a kind of like, yes, we can do this, but I don't know. I think the phrase, be the change you want to see happen, you hear it less in the last few years. And I think people feel increasingly powerless to do that, really. And that's depressing. And so figuring out what that phrase could mean for each of us and for my students was an interesting exercise. But they're like, what are you talking about? Like, where do we start? There was a kind of where do we start aspect to it that was tough to hear.
It seems like over the generations, how people approach that question seems to be changing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's about that time. We're going to open it up for questions. And we have a few minutes, so friendly reminder to please, I think you already shared all the questions. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So yeah, it's about time for questions. And would love to get the first of them for Benoit.
And I apologize. It's very hard to see faces, so I may know you, I might not, but I don't think I'm ignoring you. I just can't see very well.
All right, we have our first question. Okay, this is very specific. What did Werner say about his name change? This is a multi-part, don't respond yet. What did Werner say about his name change? Or what stood out to you most about being with him? His work has been a lot about who you wound up being and creating new possibilities. Maybe you can backtrack with a little reminder for our group here who Werner is.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Were you part of EST?
My dad was part of EST, and then I did the forum when I was 16.
Okay, nice. So I did the forum as part of research for this. And, I did a lot of like transformative things, right? And so the forum, so I did it online because it was, I don't know, they were doing them online then. And so these are these intense, for those that don't know, so EST, founded when late 60 something, and this were these very intense weekend that became very controversial because they were like, at the time it was much more like berating people. It's become softer over the years, and it's this weekend of transformation essentially. And that you all can help me, but it's basically we make our own reality and we live in these false realities. Many of us are living outside the stadium of our lives, and we're just watching our lives, and it's an attempt to sort of make us truly live our lives. I write more about it in the book. Werner, so I did the thing, I did the weekend, and I was shocked, and I told Werner this when we met in London. I said, and I had read a lot. So the thing about EST that partially what made them so controversial is just how much upselling they're doing, like immediately. Like you're in the thing, and they say you will be transformed. Your life will never be the same after this weekend. But so there's that, and then but we need you to sign up for all these additional things. And so I told Werner that I found that even as I actually, there were things that I really enjoyed about the weekend. And I was like, wow, there are some tools that about like, one of the things that I remember is about like fully living in my life and taking chances. There was a big thing about sort of taking chances and living, I forget the term, like, living like more radically like in my life. And I had spent so much of my life, partially because I'm a journalist, but then also just because of my personality, having like one foot in my life and one foot out. I was like I was in a fraternity before I realized I was gay, and I was one foot in there and one foot out. In relationships, one foot in, one foot out, just everywhere, one foot in, one foot out. And so this was like there were great things about it. One of them was like, put both feet in and see what happens. I told Werner about this, and I didn't really write about this actually in the book because it didn't fit in the chapter, but he actually said, yeah, we're changing that. And I'm like, well, you had a lot of years to do this. I don't, but he said, you're right, like we're trying to make the sales pitch a little softer. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense because this is really unbelievable what you're doing. Like, I wanna participate in this thing, but you're distracting me so much with the constant upselling. And I don't know if that was your experience or if you had. So Werner, about his name change, he had never really thought about it, which I found fascinating. I asked him, like, are you a different person as Werner than your previous? And he leans back in his chair and he goes, wow, that is interesting. And he had never thought about the question. As like introspective seemingly as he is, which I found really interesting. You know, basically, you all have to read the chapter, but essentially he's like, I see my life in eras now, and one era was over, and he sounds like a young person in this way. I'm dividing my lives in eras, and one era was over, and now I'm in this new era. We had a fascinating few hours, only some of which is in the book. I can talk to you about it after, if you're interested. I found him incredibly charming. And I mean, he looks at you with his eyes, and you realize, you understand why so many people like followed him, because he is really magnetic and really charming, and I liked him as a person. I found the forum, I had mixed feelings about the forum, and I had mixed feelings about what he was telling me, but I liked him as a person. I found that lack of introspection really interesting. It's another thing, very quickly, political identity changers often it's like I'm asking them for the first time why they shifted, you know, and the classic answer is, I didn't change, my party changed, and I just did the math, and I realized that, you know, my party was wrong and the other party was right. In reality, there's an incredible amount of like emotion, lost friends, we're being shamed by our group. There's all kinds of reasons that we change our political beliefs separate from like simply doing the math. I wanted to get that in because we didn't talk about politics.
Yeah.
Yep.
So our next question is, I know this is not a self-help book, but what advice do you have for people struggling to change?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you come out with a book that's about change, how it gets, like how bookstores and how your own publisher describes it. And this was a thing. What can I say about this? What do I feel comfortable saying about this? This was a point of tension around me being like, this is not a self-help book. This is a book about psychology and American culture right now. But there's a way in which people have interpreted it as a self-help book, and people are like, well, that's not gonna hurt sales. And I'm like, you know, if people read this book like thinking it's a self-help book, which some people have, I think they're going to be very disappointed because it's not. It's like I'm going and talking to people about how they think they changed, and it's deeply reported. At the same time, there's like a smidge of self-help. Would you say? I don't know.
Self-kindness?
Yeah. So there's the self-kindness, people trying to change. I think I'll just sort of repeat what I said, which is that we have to, I think it's really great to have intention about how we want to change. And then I also think that we have to lean into and be okay with the fact that we're not totally controlling the process of how we change. And that second part is not a very easy thing to accept. But I think it is real. The other thing I would say is that we need people in our lives who are going to help us and who are going to believe us. I was lucky to marry someone who, I think just because of his personality, I don't think he intended to do this in any way, but just because of his personality is very accepting. So there's no part of him that has tried to change me, and I don't try to change him. And that has been transformative. Just the fact that like, oh, I can bring all of myself, and that's fine. And he's not going to try to change me, and I'm not going to try to change him. So I think there's a way in which it's also in relationships. My parents both did a lot of work to change themselves. And so being in relationship with them, I think, has helped me change in the ways that I have. But again, I don't think I've changed all that much other than, and this is big, self-acceptance, gentleness, and being more vulnerable in my relationships. So is that personality change? I don't know. I still struggle with things that I struggle with, and there's ways in which I need to remind myself to be gentle with myself. But I think creating the conditions in our lives where that we think change is more likely to happen, and surrounding ourselves with people who can help us do that.
Thank you. And you kind of briefly spoke to this before, but one of the ways that people kind of try to kickstart change, and that now a lot of universities are funding and supporting research on, though for many, many years has been historically used in indigenous communities, is psychedelics.
Yep.
As you've mentioned, you've dabbled in a few yourself.
Yeah. Not much though, but yeah.
That's what he says.
No, I mean, I have one, yeah, I've done a little bit, but I've not done ayahuasca. So I've not done these things that many people have done. Yeah.
You share an experience where you went with a guide
Yeah.
and took psychedelic mushrooms in
Yeah.
Colorado, enough for transformation, but not to be like
Yeah.
elsewhere. Can you share a bit about that experience
Yeah.
and how that helped expand your sense of change in self and help your own individual growth?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So I'll just start by saying, I think one of the things that's so interesting about psychedelics is the fears that we have about how we might change on them. So I met this guy naked in the baths at Esalen, which is like perched over the Pacific down in Big Sur. And he was there for a different thing. And, we had this he just looked like a future life coach. He's like, he leans in. First of all, everyone's talking about how gay they are as I walk in. And he's like, I'm 20% gay, which I didn't believe. But, anyway, he said, and then he sort of leans into me and he says, what do you think is trying to emerge? He was very spiritual and, all of that. And years later, he, to my shock, was like, do you want a guide for this experience that you want to have? And I said, yeah, but I'm not going to pay you, and I'm not going to write your full name in the book. He's like, no, that's not what this is about. He's like, I'm happy to do it for, I get a lot out of this too. And just the fact that he was like so present with me for that weekend and didn't want anything from that was incredible. I mean, I was like, because we knew each other, but we were not super close, and that he just did this for me was incredible. And so the fear, sorry, I started with this and then I got sidetracked. The fear is I'm going to take psychedelics and I am going to see, the psychedelics are going to tell me, there's the common fear of like, all right, I'm going to lose control. But other than that, there's the fear of the psychedelics are going to tell me how I need to change. They're going to reveal to me that the life I'm living is wrong or some big thing needs to shift. And so either I'm going to have to do that, or I'm going to have to live with the knowledge that I'm supposed to be living another life, and I'm not going to do it. So this is like, I had this fear, and Drew told me that a lot of people had this fear. I took not a huge amount, a decent amount of mushrooms, enough that, and I had intentions about what I wanted to do, and enough, and I explain it in the book, that like, I saw these doors that I could enter, like trauma or sex or parent, whatever. And I had taken the right amount so that I could like choose what door I wanted to go in, as opposed to like if I had taken a bigger amount, I would have been projected into the door that the mushrooms wanted me to go in. So I had some control. And so so the experience itself felt quite gentle, which I'm now connecting. Like it felt, even though there was like crying and laughing, and it was like, but it was all like it was gentle. And it was in that moment that I had a kind of realization. But I've also had powerful experiences, similar experiences that were not on psychedelics. And I talk a lot about this with my dad, because my dad has never taken psychedelics and is kind of a big believer in I mean, he's like, take psychedelics if you want, but we can do a lot of these things without psychedelics. And I think that that's right. I think psychedelics, and Drew talked about them as being a tool, not the answer. There's a lot of people saying, like, if everyone took psychedelics, mushrooms, like, the world would be transformed and everyone would be happy. And I think a lot of people who are like saying those things, and a lot of like leaders in the psychedelic movement
Are taking too many mushrooms?
are taking too many mushrooms and have skipped some of the steps that they would need to. They've done spiritual bypassing. They've skipped some of the work that they need to do. And so, so I think they're an incredible tool. We'll see what happens, right? Where, like, with all of the, the regulation, and I don't know what's going to happen. So we'll see.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for joining us tonight and for being part of this conversation about identity transformation and the very many different ways we can interpret and experience change. Our thanks to Benoit Denizet-Lewis, author of You've Changed, The Promise and Price of Self-Transformation. Benoit will be available to sign books just after the program. For information about Commonwealth Club membership and upcoming programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Shuka Kalantari. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.